Mr. General Petraeus, thank you so much for being with us. First, I'm going to ask you about the latest news, assassination of Hamas leader in Tehran. As a former CIA director, what does this operation indicate for you from Israel intelligence capabilities in Iran right now?
Well, first of all, I just want to specify up front, this is not based on any conversation with my old colleagues at the CIA. I've deliberately not done that so that all that I assess, if you will, is based on my judgment, based on the open source reports that have come in. And based on that, and I'll explain why in a moment, based on that, my sense is that the Israeli intelligence services once again have demonstrated how thoroughly they have penetrated different elements inside Iran. The most plausible explanation that I have heard of how this was carried out is that it was a result of a bomb planted months ago in the guest house where Haniyeh ultimately stayed, indicating again how thoroughly they have penetrated, in this case, the Revolutionary Guards Corps, which reportedly controls that particular guest house and secures it. So this is all carried out well in advance with the idea that at some point, a very senior person would be there and they could activate this explosive. This seems far more plausible to me than, I don't know, a drone strike, which just is way beyond the range imaginable, or a precision missile or something like that, which in real time seems very difficult to carry out. We've seen this before. We saw this with the assassination of Fakhrizadeh, the head of the Iran nuclear program, as you'll recall, and that was carried out by a remote-controlled machine gun by the side of the road that targeted him as he drove by, again indicating enormous understanding of his pattern of life and also extraordinary technological capabilities. And we've seen it on a number of other occasions, at least allegedly, in other operations that have been carried out inside Iran. So the intelligence assets, the, again, technical capabilities, the on-the-ground operational skill. Remember when they stole all of the documents for the Iran nuclear program, in another case, in a warehouse. This is really quite extraordinary in a country that in many respects is viewed as a denied space to other intelligence services. So it's very, very impressive.
Does the US intelligence service also involve in this operation with Israel to Iran or no?
I actually suspect not, but I don't know. And again, if I did know, I wouldn't comment. But no.
How about those operations that you were in charge of CIA on that time?
Then I can't talk about those, of course. I mean, allegedly, certain things happened that allegedly were carried out jointly by the US and Israel. Again, according to the New York Times, say Stuxnet or some of the other activities that were intended to degrade, to slow down the progress of the Iran nuclear program. But I can't comment on those reports by the New York Times or, say, in the various books of some of the great journalists like David Sanger. But there have also been numerous cases where there is not a conversation, in some cases because the U.S. might not actually, in a sense, sanction something or support it. And I think Israel knows when to work with the U.S., when to consult with the U.S., to advise the U.S., and on occasion, I think, not to do so.
How do you predict Iranian reaction, in the retaliation? Do you think Iranian going to directly involve in the conflict in Middle East?
Well, I think they have to respond very clearly for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, it's just expected. This is a very significant, it's an enormous blow to Iran's honor, if you will, that this very senior individual is in their country. It's a huge intelligence failure and a readiness failure, if you will, a security failure as well. So they have to respond. But I don't think that Iran wants to get into a real direct back and forth war with Israel, nor do I think Hezbollah wants to do that as they respond to the Israeli response to the horrific killing of a dozen or so essentially children's soccer players, a Druze community of all things, in the Golan Heights, which was clearly attributed to Hezbollah. Israel responded, of course, took out the military head of Hezbollah, a very significant target. And so Hezbollah is going to have some kind of response, but in neither case do I think that Iran or Hezbollah want to get into a major conflict with Israel. And frankly, I don't think Israel wants to get in a real full-on war with Hezbollah or with Iran either, because the damage to Israel would be very substantial, given the number of missiles and drones and rockets that Hezbollah has at its disposal, nearly 150,000 of them, and even the sophisticated, layered Israeli air and ballistic missile defense system, even supported by the US as it was very effectively during the strikes from Iran directly to Israeli soil, with the 350 approximately ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. I don't think they want to get into this with each other because the damage to both sides would be very, very substantial. Keep in mind that the damage done by Israel to southern Lebanon, to Hezbollah infrastructure and so forth in the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, we continually reassessed over time as having been far greater than we thought it was actually at that time in 2006. When I went from the surge in Iraq to Central Command, say late 2008, somewhere in 2009, 2010, I recall doing an assessment of what took place back in 2006. The original assessment of which was that the Israeli Air Force had overpromised and underdelivered. And it turned out that they had done far more damage than we originally assessed. And part of the problem was that Hezbollah was really struggling just to rebuild all of the damaged infrastructure. And then when I was CIA director some years after that, after going to Afghanistan, commanding there, and then to the agency, we did yet another assessment and concluded that it was even greater. Now that was then. Now Israel could do much more damage to Hezbollah, but correspondingly Hezbollah can do much more damage to Israel. It could overwhelm, again, the air and ballistic missile defense systems. Keep in mind that these are never unlimited, and if you launch enough at one time, that system can get overloaded, and Israel has to prioritize then. And the priority presumably has to be, inescapably, has to be military infrastructure to enable you to continue to respond accordingly, critical infrastructure, and then population centers. As difficult and excruciatingly difficult it is to determine that prioritization. So again, I think Israel certainly wants to push Hezbollah north of the Litani River to get them out of range of the settlements, the Israeli settlements in the northern part of their country, from which at least 60,000 Israelis have been displaced because of the threat, in particular, of the short-range rockets, the 107 millimeter and the 122 millimeter. This is similar to what we did in Baghdad during the second half of the surge when we fought the Iranian-supported Shia militia. And we were getting hammered by volleys of 107 millimeter in particular in the green zone. So it was 12 to 15 volleys of 15 or so rockets at a time throughout the day. It was really almost unlivable.
If I get back to about recent tension between Iran and Israel, how do you see personally that? Do you support as the most strongest ally for Israel? Do you support those kind of operation and the recent tension between Israel and Iran?
It's interesting that President Biden commented about this. I think it was last night, I believe, at the ceremony when they were welcoming home the hostages in this hostage deal with Russia, where he said that that had been unhelpful to the effort to reach a ceasefire. I'm not sure I would quite go that far, but it's at least arguable. Again, the political figure who is most engaged in those negotiations generally assessed not to be as hardline as the actual commander on the ground in Gaza, who is much more, again, difficult and a much more important figure, frankly. So again, you can debate this, I think. in the end of the day, I think Iran will respond. They will try to thread the needle in the way that Israel responded to the enormous attack of, the 350 roughly missiles and drones. And they sent a very powerful message, remember. Israel hit an air defense site in an area of Iran that had 3 nuclear sites in it, Esfahan. So they hit a military target. They showed that unlike what Iran did, and unable to do anything meaningful with their many more numerous drones and missiles, Iran penetrated it, hit an air defense site that's supposed to defend them, and did so in an area where there are 3 nuclear programs. And that sent quite a signal, I think. And yet it was not escalatory. I remember, in fact, discussion with Israeli comrades about what should be the objectives of a response. There had to be a response, again, Israel in that time as well. And it was foolish of the United States to leak that, we wanted them to take the win, if you say, just accept the fact that you defeated their enormous. There had to be a response to the first ever attack from Iranian territory onto Israeli soil. But to do it in a way that would send a message, that would demonstrate a capability, but would not put pressure on the situation to escalate further. And I think that Iran will do something like that. There's a whole menu, I'm sure they're looking at, everything from trying to hit a military site or, again, that kind of thread the needle, all the way up to hitting critical infrastructure or a major port or something like that. If that actually was to succeed, Israel would have to respond in a very massive way, not unlike the way that they responded to the Houthi drone attack the other day, or the missile attack that killed an Israeli citizen, and they did enormous damage to the port of Hodeidah in Yemen.
How about, US and Iran? During your time as a US military commander in Middle East, you and Iran, especially with the Qasem Soleimani, you were closely working together to, against ISIS in Iraq, right? And many
not at all. No, with respect. At the time that I was there, if Qasem Soleimani had ever set foot in Iraq, and we had a drone overhead, he would not have made it as long as he did.
How about US and Iran working in cooperation to, just combat ISIS?
Not really at that time, no. There was occasional conversation, but again, from the perspective of the guy on the ground in Iraq, commanding in Iraq, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps was enabling, funding, training, equipping, often directing Shia militia that were killing our soldiers. So we assessed that, for example, at least 600 or 700 Americans were killed alone by the explosively formed penetrators. These were very highly milled that could slice through the armor of an M1 tank. And again, they were providing those to the militia. They were also providing lots of other arms and ammunition and weapon systems. And frankly, again, if he had set foot on Iraqi soil, he probably would not have made it back to Iran. And he never did do that. He sent me a message one time during the Battle of Basra when we were battling the Shia militia down there. This was in late March, early April of 2008. Through the president of Iraq, of all people, who actually flew up to Sulaymaniyah province in the Kurdish regional government, and then set foot into Iran, which is where he met with Qasem Soleimani, then came back to Sulaymaniyah, flew back to Baghdad, asked me to fly over that night in a helicopter to the presidential palace, and he conveyed the message from Qasem Soleimani that said, essentially, General Petraeus, you should know that I, Qasem Soleimani, control the policy for Iran when it comes to Iraq. And oh, by the way, also Afghanistan, Syria, southern Lebanon, and Gaza. In other words, you should deal with me. Forget those diplomats. You and I should sit down and talk this out.
What was your reaction?
I told him to pound sand. So, I wasn't going to deal with this guy. He was killing our soldiers. He was enabling the Shia militia to cause violence, to intimidate large numbers of Iraqi citizens. The country was still in a Sunni-Shia civil war, although we had dramatically reduced the Sunni component of that. and had driven violence down, even by that time already by some, I don't know, 60 or 70%, ultimately to drive it down by nearly 90% during the 18 months of the surge. But it reflected his enormous power. So he was not just a military commander or, say, a counter-terrorism force commander, Joint Special Operations Command equivalent. He was also the equivalent of the State Department officials responsible for policy for that region. So he was determining the policy and then actually implementing it in a cross between CIA director, JSOC commander, and again, Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East, something like this. Very, very powerful position. It grew further. And to be fair to your question earlier, eventually there was not active support of the Iranian-supported militia during the fight against the Islamic State when they were able to reconstitute after our final forces withdrew, and Prime Minister Maliki pursued highly sectarian actions that started to tear apart the fabric of society between Sunni and Shia that we had put together during the surge and solidified in the subsequent 3.5 years. Keep in mind that we didn't just drive violence down by nearly 90% during the surge. That violence continued to go down during the next 3.5 years, during which we withdrew our forces, which was the ultimate validation of the success of the strategy that we carried out, despite all the other challenges. And unfortunately, after that, when Prime Minister Maliki took these actions, the Iraqi security forces took their eye off the remnants. We had destroyed the Islamic State during that time and kept it destroyed. And now they're focused on Sunni demonstrations instead of ensuring that the Islamic State cannot reconstitute. They did that. They went into Syria, the Syrian civil war. They gained a lot of additional fighters, power, money, leadership, explosives expertise, weapon systems, came back into northern Iraq as an army, really, with organized units, almost like a conventional force. Took Mosul in northern Iraq. Mosul became the capital of the Islamist extremist caliphate for Iraq, Raqqa the capital for northeastern Syria. And, they were threatening Baghdad. And unfortunately, that gave license to the Shia militia that we had destroyed as well to come back into uniform and back on the streets bearing arms. And they've never been able to get them off the streets ever since. To be fair, they did contribute significantly to the fight against the Islamic State, in which we were enabling the Iraqi security forces and trying not to enable the Shia militia. But clearly there was some degree of working together at that time.
Despite all what you mentioned early on, there are kind of reluctance here in Washington, D.C. to escalate tension with Iran, especially in last government
Yes.
here. Do you think how long this kind of policy would continue, against Iran, considering all happening last recent years?
I suspect that the policy get much tougher after the election, regardless of who is elected. Donald Trump has said that he will reimpose some of the sanctions, though I should note that they didn't exactly succeed in what they hoped they would do, which was bring about regime change, which I always thought was a misplaced hope. The regime is far too robust, it's far too large. You can't topple this regime the way you toppled Mubarak or some of the other leaders in Tunisia, Yemen, and so forth during the Arab Spring. This is a very substantial structure, as you know far better than I, that it starts with the supreme leader, those right around him, then the Revolutionary Guards Corps, which has its own Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, separate from the normal Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine. And then you have the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, which yes is more expeditionary and focused more outside, but it can focus internally as well. And then of course, most damagingly in certain respects, you have the besieged militia, which can put maybe as many as 2 million thugs on the streets with a lot more than just pipes. And they'll clear those streets if they have to in a real extreme measure. So they've never shown a reluctance to kill their own citizens when it comes to that. Now that's not the preferred path. They know that that can result in enormous demonstrations, as we have seen when they have killed individuals. But they don't shrink from that. And they're not going to separate themselves from the supreme leader the way that the Egyptian military stepped back from Mubarak and allowed him to go under the bus and to be deposed. So again, a very different situation. But the Trump administration, I think, clearly will reimpose some sanctions that may have been reduced or lifted. I think, frankly, that a Harris presidency will do the same. The truth is, right now, in an election year, you're worried about the price of gasoline at the gas pump. And if they, for example, impose sanctions that reduce the ability of Iran to export 1.5 million barrels of oil and distillates, the price of gas is going to go up. So, and the very people who are criticizing the Biden administration for being soft on Iran will be the first ones to criticize the Biden administration over the increase of a gallon of gasoline. So it's a difficult situation. I don't think you'll see anything really meaningful unless Iran dramatically escalates, goes after Americans directly, or has its Shia proxy go after Americans in a very significant way, in which case I think you'd see some kind of retaliation that would be necessary. As you saw, in fact, when the Americans were killed at that base that's just inside Jordan, right next to Syria and the Iraqi border.
In which level this retaliation do you think that would happen?
It depends entirely on what is done, what transpires, how Iran acts. We have more forces in the region. It was announced today that we are reinforcing our capabilities there. I'm sure it's both for our own self-defense, our own protection, our own ability to respond, and also to help Israel if Israel is under attack again in the way that they were in that previous episode, where more than 300 drones and missiles were sent at them.
As a last question, I'm going to ask you about your opinion regarding to a new president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian. He's coming from reformist wings in Iran. He has been, his campaign on the lowering tension with the Western countries, in order to reduce the sanction on Iran. Do you think that he can make a change, at least, with the Western countries?
There might be some changes at the margin, and some of these could be significant. If, for example, he was willing to cut a deal on the Iran nuclear program again, because that program is very, very threatening right now. As you know, they are just one enrichment cycle away from being able to produce weapons-grade uranium. But they know that if they do that, there's a strong likelihood that the United States will destroy the Iran nuclear program. And I should note, it's publicly known that that plan was developed the first time during the time that I was the US Central Command commander. Now, it's more difficult now. Iran has developed additional capabilities. It's got Russian air defense systems, although we saw Israel penetrate those the other day. But that prospect is very much there, and they're keenly aware of that. Do they really want to force the United States and perhaps Israel together again to destroy their nuclear program, or do they want to leave it just at the threshold level, the threshold of actually enriching to weapons grade and being able to actually make a nuclear device? I think it's possible that he might be willing to bargain something of that away, restore a more stable situation than the current one, which is, very close to instability, in return for a reduction of some of the sanctions or what have you. On the other hand, the really concerning aspects of Iran, the drones and missile in which they're also selling to Russia, support for these malign actors, as they're called, the very, very malign militias and really armed forces that they support in Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Shia militia in Iraq and in Syria, Houthis in Yemen who are disrupting traffic through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. That's another problem. I don't think he has any control over that because, as I mentioned earlier, the individual who controls that policy and the implementation is, again, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force. And then in terms of some of the other aspects of a very conservative regime, I think it's limited what he can actually do. What he might be able to do would be to reduce the role of the religious police, if you will, in enforcing wearing the hijab and so on like that. And that actually could provide some degree of relief for the people. It's possible he could carry out limited reforms of the economy. again, you have a country with incredible blessings that has totally mismanaged them because of its very, very dangerous activities, again, malign activities in the region. At the end of the day, though, I think you have to be very clear-eyed about Iran. You know, there's several, we used to call these CENTCOM truths. And the first truth is, in the Middle East, always know who your enemies and your friends are, and never confuse one for the other. And Iran is an enemy. It is sworn to the destruction of Israel and to pushing the United States out of the Gulf region. Israel is a friend for all of the issues that we have with them at various times. Again, the Gulf states are friends. Number two is to remember that Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there doesn't stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, in many cases, tsunamis of refugees, not just into neighboring countries in the Middle East, but all the way into the countries of our most important NATO allies. As we saw, for example, with the Syrian civil war at its height and the huge number of refugees through Turkey and into Europe, and then others from other countries that are struggling as well. And then the third is to recognize that this continued effort of the U.S. to leave the Middle East, this is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in, and you might as well acknowledge that and determine what is the most effective and efficient force structure required to ensure our objectives in the region, and then maintain that, sustain it, and stop scaring all the people in the region who are afraid that we're going to leave because we're trying to do the pivot to Asia or the rebalance to Asia. Without question, the Indo-Pacific is the most important theater in the world for the U.S. and the Western world. But the United States has a lot of global responsibilities. We're like the guy in the circus who's keeping a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, helped by our allies and partners if we treat them well. Yes, the biggest plate in that tent is the one that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China. But there's a lot of other plates that are very threatening and challenging that emanate from the Middle East. And you've got to keep those plates spinning too, and we can. The U.S. is capable of doing that and of supporting our partners in Ukraine, where Russia is trying to deny them their very independence and trying to crush them. So that's how you have to look at this region, I think. Try to manage it to the extent that you absolutely positively can, and just keep avoiding the kind of major conflict that would result if indeed Hezbollah and Israel got into a full-on war, or Israel and Iran a full-on war, or some of the other scenarios. And to be fair, I think that's what we are trying to do, although there are times when I question some of the ways that we're going about it and some aspects of some of the objectives as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. David Petraeus, for being with us, and thank you for your time.
It's great to be with you again, Marzia. Thank you.